I would like to briefly introduce what Nielsen as a company, what we do in the region around the world. So very humbly, but with great pride, we call ourselves the consumer intelligence company of the world. That means we look into the consumer habits, how the market is responding to different changes within the region, what are the driving factors that will work towards any category within any consumer basket in the FMCG market, and then how do different players within this market respond to the market conditions. So all of that kind of helps us in looking at the landscape of any country around the world. As part of Nielsen, we have a global footprint around the world covering about 100 countries, having about 42,000 associates in the world working diligently, very closely with retailers, manufacturers, distributors, end-to-end the entire supply chain to understand what really goes within the FMCG sector. And because of the complexity of the FMCG sector, it's always a very interesting sector because you really cannot expect something that goes up. So in the past few years, we have seen a lot of dynamic shift within the region, which has also made the region very, very interesting. Now, how we work on what we do when we talk about consumer intelligence or market insights, we aim to provide the full view of the market. That means we look at what is happening, why something is happening particularly, and then how to go about it, what actions needed to be done to make sure those changes are well responded to. So this is what we call the full view at Nielsen. And in collaboration with the Food and Beverage Manufacturers Group in the UAE, what we have done this past year is that we have created a very detailed, very research-driven report, which we refer to as the annual report, which has a very high-level but very insightful look into all the categories within the food and beverage manufacturing sector. And that is something that I would like you to have a sneak peek into, because the entire report itself, it's a very detailed report. Once you see it, you are going to get lost into it, and probably I'll need 2 days to just talk about what's going on into it. But just to give you a sneak peek into what really is inside the annual report, let me take you through a little bit about what's going on in the world as with a global picture, and then take you down into the region, which is the Africa, Middle East region, and then take you down into the UAE, the market UAE, which is also, again, very interesting. The first and foremost, we'll have a look at the global market outlook. And as you know that globally, it's very, very common to find out even anybody who's not in the sector could very easily identify that the entire segment or the entire sector is responding to a price inflation. There is a certain price inflation that's happening everywhere, and how that's changing what the consumer is looking at. So the consumers are responding to increasing fuel costs. They are responding to increasing charges of electricity. Grocery costs are rising up. There are supply restrictions. There are limited availability of resources. And all of that put together is having an effect on the consumer, where the consumers are becoming more price conscious. They are more conscious about their wallets. And that has also changed the priorities or preferences of these consumers. So now when we look at the consumer of today, they are different versus the consumer of 2 years ago, right? And that's how the market has to respond to the behaviors of what consumer is doing today. We had a survey conducted for the consumers globally, and across these 3 metrics, which indicate how stable or how secure any consumer feels about themselves. The first metric is economic stability, household income level, and the ability to meet daily expenses. About 30 to 40% of consumers generally are feeling less secure across all the 3 metrics. Only 5 to 10% feel secure on any of the 3 metrics, right? Which means people or consumers in general are uncertain, right? And that uncertainty is showing in how they are shopping. Every choice that they make is very cautious, very careful, and the whole idea of brand loyalties, the whole idea of marketing and everything else has completely changed in this new time. If I talk about UAE, we have segmented the UAE consumer into 5. Basically, starting from the left, these are the strugglers. And when we talk about the strugglers, these are the ones who have lost financially between the pre and post-COVID times. 18% of the consumer fall into this basket. There's 38% of consumers who fall in the rebounders. That means they have significantly been impacted by COVID, but have recovered. And only about 6% have experienced a thriving feeling. That means they feel that they are better off than they were pre-COVID. If you look at this chart, that gives and I like to look at it from a very binary vision. So I look at it at the extreme end, the 16% who do not have a significant change in their choice, pre and post-COVID, right? They still continue, and these are the ones who still spend on luxury. They still continue to spend on brands that they really like, that they keep close to them. But if you look at the other 84% on the left-hand side, this is where there is a change coming in, right? And this is where not only price, but the whole idea of being healthy, the whole idea of a lifestyle change, the whole idea of making less and less impact of their presence, all of that is coming into place. So when we talk about the change, we talk about the 84%, and that's the majority that's driving this change. And this is across multiple variables. As I said, this comes across in how not only the lifestyle is changing, but also how consumers are spending. So if you look at the top side of this, about 44% pre and post-COVID, and all of these figures are pre and post-COVID. If you see now, 44% of the consumers versus previously would like to cook more at home, right? One of the aspects coming to that is whether they want to save money, that's one. The other is they also want to be healthier. So the health alternatives and the health side of that is also becoming more and more important. About 40% are trying to minimize the waste, so they want to have less and less impact on the planet. 37% are now spending less on clothing and grooming. So you see an overall lifestyle shift, which also translates down to how people are spending less in groceries. 31% will buy whatever there is on promotion, right? And now this is a big figure. This is a great insight coming out, because when I say 31% will buy whatever is on promotion, that kind of takes away the whole idea of sticking to brands and being pleased by marketing gimmicks, right? Now it's really time about whether you can compete on price, you can work on price elasticities, whether you can work on promotions. All of that is now very important. 20% have started to opt for private label, and that's something that we have seen in the UAE is blooming, is growing now. So you see a lot of private labels coming in, and almost within all categories we see private labels are growing very strongly. This is also coming down into how consumers are now searching for the products that they are looking for. So when I think about UAE, I also like to include the neighboring market, KSA as well, right? And to understand, because the two markets are very similar in terms of how they behave, right? And more or less they behave very much alike in the level of how the consumers really search for the products that they want, right? Do they really go directly to the brands that they like? Do they want to just pick up what they have been purchasing historically, right? If you look at the figures, it's more about that the consumers are becoming cautious. They're looking hard enough for not only the brands, but also the prices, their environmental impact, the sustainability effect, the health and well-being, whether they have the right nutritions in it. And all of these figures, if you especially look at the last one, which is very interesting, 64% like to know the story behind the brand, right? So it's no longer about just the ingredients, just the nutrients, just the flavor. It's also about what story is the brand communicating to its consumers, right? And all of this is happening because of a trigger in inflation, trigger of price shifts, right? So people want to now become choosy and get the best out of their wallets. Having said that, the picture is not so bleak. There are 70% within the region, within the AME region, when we look at a survey, 70% within the AME want to buy or try out new things, right? So they want to, they want to go for new stuff, they want to try them out, they want to develop new habits. But at the same time, only 5% of the launches that happen within this sector, within the food and beverage sector, or the overall FMCG sector, so to say, only 5% really succeed, right? That's the gap between why this is happening is kind of instilled into what is the message that manufacturers are producing out or giving out to the consumers and what the consumers are looking for. So the gap between these two is pretty big, right? And that shows up because if at all, this number would be higher and we would expect more new launches to work in the market. I'll not go through this entire detail. This is just to answer why they don't, for example. And if you look at the top 3 parts of this, these are the highest rated parts of what consumers are actually looking for when they go out shopping, when they go out for a grocery shopping, let's say. Only 6% of the consumers have not tried anything new, right? Which means, thank you. Only 6% of consumers have not tried anything new, which means 94% of the consumers are looking for new things. But what are they looking for? The top 3 would tell you they are, first of all, looking on whether the product is benefiting, that it's fitting their needs. Absolutely, that's 100%. Now, again, the next one is whether they find a new brand and they wanted to try something different, right? That's the second one. That means it's, again, one of the higher ones. The attractive promo or display or ad for the brand, that lands at the third with a 37%. And the remaining 4, 5, and 6, for example, the reviews online, whether it came up on a conversation, it's attractive, it's unique packaging, all of that to do with the marketing and the media around it, that's all landing on the 3rd to 6th position. Only 14% that you see at the bottom and the 5% that you see at the bottom, these are the only ones that have bought something new just by accident. All of the rest, and again, I like to see it with a binary lens. When I see the ones below, these are the ones that did not really want to buy anything new. But when you look at the top, for some reason or the other, they were enticed to buy into new things, right? And that's where the gap is falling in because the manufacturers very often are looking to fulfill the needs but are failing to do so in the long run. So we see a lot of new innovative companies not being able to have the same impact on the shelves as a larger player. Now I'll talk about some of the important aspects within the UAE as well, which will bring me to the same point again. Now, when you look at the consumers, the survey shows you one picture, right? So the survey shows you about what the consumers really say, right? About their choices, what they want to buy, how they decide their purchases, but what are they actually buying is a different story, right? And this is the gap that we try to fulfill, and that's when we talk about the full view. Now, this is very interesting. When we look at the UAE market, we see the dip that you see over here, that's 21, and that's the pre-COVID time, right? So that's the COVID era, and when you see the growth, that's when you see the COVID time, the COVID peak falling down, and we see the growth back again. Very evident growth pre and post-COVID. So during the COVID time, we see that the volumes, which are the gray ones, which usually indicate the consumption. They talk about how much something is being consumed. Within the FMCG overall segment, we see that right after the COVID period, there is a natural spike, there's a growth trend, everything is in green, it's going up, there's a quarter-on-quarter growth again. But if you notice, the growth is coming from the lighter gray side, right? The lighter gray is more about value, about prices. So the growth is coming because of price inflations, right? And quarter on quarter, you can see the price, the light gray part is increasing, which means the effect of growth is primarily from prices, less from consumption. Consumption is the dark gray part on the graph. So you see that there is a trend, which is good news. There's a value growth in terms of the FMCG. But overall, that's coming from prices. When we look at the food and beverage sector within the UAE, we see the food and beverage sector on the left, the overall growth is about 10.7%. Now this 10.7% has growth versus past year has been driven, if you see the two metrics, the blue and the green. The blue shows the value, the green shows the volume, which means the consumption. So we are measuring them against price inflation versus volume versus consumption. So the overall F&B has grown by 10.7%, 8% of which has come from price inflations or price growth, and 3% from volume consumption, volume growth. And if you notice, with the baskets within the F&B, we see very healthy growth across snacking basket, showing a growth both in value and volume. Both the green and blue are increasing. If you look at the bakery segment, they are also increasing within this. Some of the categories like beverages, ambient food, dairy, frozen food are still trying to keep up, but have been responding to the growth. And in those cases, primarily you can see the blue line is much more than the green, which means the growth that's coming in that segment is primarily due to inflation, primarily due to price rises, right? So the volume consumption has not increased. What has happened is because of price rises, we see that there is possibly a decline in volume, and which is a natural phenomenon. When you have price increases, consumers fall to smaller packs, lower number of items. Now, something that's interesting is when we look at the overall FMCG here, the top players, if you notice on the right-hand side of the graph, which, let's say the top 5 players, which make up 10% of the total FMCG, the growth of those five manufacturers, or the top 10, is not as fast as the bottom ones. So when we see the top 31 to 100, the top 100%, these are the ones that are driving that growth, really. So we notice that the smaller players within the entire food and beverage industry, they are the ones that are leading this growth coming in. And of course, something that needs to be noticed and highlighted is the growth of private labels. So private labels are becoming increasingly important. Some would say this is becoming a threat, but at the same time, for the consumers, it's also becoming a relief at the same time, right? Because of the prices, the availability, and all of that. But whatever you may call it, it's becoming more and more important. The growth is becoming important. And this is something where a lot of established manufacturers are moving into. So this is something that you would see as a highlight. Again, it goes without saying, when we talk about the food and beverage, another growing channel that's coming in is e-commerce, right? And when we had a survey this year about the consumers in UAE, about 80% of the consumers feel the pinch of inflation, and they feel that about 80% of the categories in the UAE are showing increasing prices year on year or quarter on quarter. And as you would see, the average prices across UAE within the past year, almost every quarter shows an increase, with a drastic increase end of last year, but still, even till this last quarter, we see that there is a growth. So you see there's a 5% increase in the prices versus the previous quarter, right? So prices have been on the rise. But what's going on in the e-commerce? Now, this is a channel that's growing very fast post-COVID, and this is something that needs to be in the highlight for almost all manufacturers that are in this, because omni-channel is now the new way to go, right? There's no one focused channel. There has to be an omni-channel strategy when manufacturers talk about their categories. Because if you notice, and just previously when you look at the FMCG, and look at this graph, right? It's a very beautiful illustration of a very bright picture coming out of the same baskets, but now in e-commerce. So when you see e-commerce, you don't see the same decline in value volume, but rather you see growth across both value and volume, across the same baskets: snacking, personal care, beverages, frozen food, dairy, ambient, home care. The only declining product is paper products, but that is generally attributed to the lack of, or the reduction of use of paper within the country overall. But apart from that, we see that almost all the categories are showing both value and volume growth in the e-commerce. And it would be interesting to also look at them side by side, right? So on the left, you see what's going on in e-commerce. On the right, you see what's going on in modern trade, for example, right? And if at all, e-commerce is something that is not under your radar, I would say this should bring it. Because on the left, you would see the same baskets, but look at the growth in volume and value chain, right? And across all the baskets, for example, when we talk about snacking, personal care, beverages, the top leading baskets across of these F&B sector, we notice that the e-commerce is kind of stealing out the share from modern trade in general. So in modern trade, which was predominant in the past, now is losing share to e-commerce. And primarily this could be attributed to, one, the convenience that e-commerce is bringing along the chains, right? The digital savviness of the people within the UAE, right? So they want to have things on their fingertips. They want to have things now versus tomorrow. So that is something that the entire population is moving towards. And it's important to notice that the size, the magnitude of growth between these two is pretty huge. And that should indicate that e-commerce is becoming significantly important in the UAE, if at all, for all the categories within them. So, and when I say e-commerce, I talk about both the pure online, which means your Amazons and the other pure online platforms, but also at the same time, the retailer online platforms. So for example, any retailer that has any online platform, that's also included in this. So any retailers, this is also a sign for retailers to be present in the online channel, right? Because that is where the growth is happening. So if you're missing out on that, it's going to be something that you need to be aware of. Now, there are certain key watch-outs for e-commerce. The first is, as I mentioned, that the FMCG is witnessing about 5% average price increase across 80% of these categories. E-com is continuing to take the share of modern trade. And even with price increases, the UAE consumer, 19% of the consumers are showing the growth within the last quarter in e-commerce. So the consumers are still willing to pay for convenience. They're still willing to go for convenience and paying higher for that. And snacking, personal care, and beverages, the leading categories are showing growth in both the modern trade channels, but also in e-commerce, faster in e-commerce than in modern trade. Now, as a manufacturer, what are some of the key things that you can do to respond to these changing behaviors? Now, I want to highlight that price or promotion is one strategy, right? But you have to look at this problem with a more diverge understanding to have a more holistic view, right? It's not only about price and promo. And by this time, this is the message I want to deliver out, that it's not only about price and promo. It's also about having the right ingredients in, because this is now what your consumers care about. They care about the right ingredients in, but also being displayed on the packaging correctly, so they can read it out. They want to know the specifics of your product locations. They want to know the source of the product, the origin of your products. They want to see the production dates. They want to see freshness, because that's how they translate it back to health and wellness. And they want to see that you are present, you as a manufacturer are present on digital shelves. So whether it's e-commerce, whether it's different pure online or brick and mortar e-commerce, they want to see you present on digital shelves, and they want to see their favorite brands to be present in an omni-channel way. In this inflationary environment, what are some of the key things that you can do along this time? And I like to think about it in 3 phases. A short-term view of designing, of building out, and take it as a framework. A short-term understanding of what you can do, then a mid-term, and in the long term. And then all your strategic decision-making can come around it. So when I look at the short term, it's about reconsidering your value equation. What message are you delivering to your consumer? right? When they're looking at your brand, are you solely relying at a brand loyalty based on historical information? Or is there something else that you're trying to incorporate? Price increases, which again, they are inevitable in this inflationary environment. They are one way to cater to the growing demand or to reach the value. But then you need to evaluate price elasticities, promo elasticities. What are the other ways in which you can reach your consumer areas? In the midterm, you need to start pivoting on the product portfolio that you have. You need to understand what is relevant across the price spectrum, what needs to be there and what doesn't need to be there, and again, segment it across the right target. You can work around changing pack sizes and formulations to remain at key price points. Innovate around new consumer needs. And then, as I said, focus on the omni-channel strategy rather than a single channel strategy, whether it be modern trade, traditional trade, pharmacy, whatever channel you're working on, think about it from an omni-channel perspective because your consumers want you present in the omni-channel space. And in the long run, disrupt and try to be present in the stores and take the market share that you're looking for. How do you do that? You localize your product assortments and shorten your supply chains. You diversify suppliers to different regions to tackle the lack of availability and restrictions that we are facing in terms of supplies. Reformulate the at-risk ingredients, forecast what the consumers are looking for, lean into technologies, things like vertical farming, organic presence of your products and ingredients, and again, as you would see within the culture, within how we are working in the UAE, evaluate how organic or plant-based options are fitting into your portfolio. Because again, that can also very well translate into how your consumers are looking into the healthier alternatives of their best food. Now, all of this and more is part of the Food and Beverage Manufacturers Group annual report that we have just collaborated on, worked on with collaboration with the Food and Beverage Manufacturers Group, and we hope that once you see that report, you're going to see the value that it's going to deliver to you in the understanding of the landscape of UAE, and then how to take that hindsight and build foresight for your business within the region and the sector. So I thank you very much for your time. And feel free to ask me any questions if you may, and later on probably we can connect and discuss more on these areas. Thanks a lot.